Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Frank Connor. I am the chair of the psychology department. I want to welcome you to the first of this year's 4 psychology department speaker series presentation. I want to, before I introduce the speaker today, I want to thank Dr. Kate Christian. Dr. Christian is a professor in the psychology department, and she is the person who has organized these 4 speakers. If you are interested in future ones, please go to the psychology department webpage, and it will list who the second speaker is for this year or this semester, and then we have 2 more next semester. We also have a series in the evening that we are sponsoring with 2 speakers that are coming to campus after normal hours, although you're students, so normal hours into 2, 3 in the morning, I guess. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, Dr. Nick Camp. Dr. Camp received his PhD from Stanford University and is currently an assistant professor of organizational studies at the University of Michigan, as well as an assistant professor by courtesy in the psychology department at the University of Michigan. His research uses body camera footage to capture the social psychology of policing, such as racial disparities in officer communications. He has been featured in Speaking of Psychology, a podcast of the American Psychological Association about his work. Please welcome Dr. Camp.
Great. Thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you for having me here today. The work I'm going to be presenting today talks about what body camera footage can tell us about the different worlds that Black and white Americans inhabit when it comes to policing in the U.S., the ways in which these encounters can corrode community trust, and hopefully how these interactions might change. So I'd like to start with a broader question. Where are we now, and how did we get here? 10 years into the Black Lives Matter movement, high-profile police killings of Sandra Bland, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and here Justin Loyola, and many others have sparked national attention, not just due to the actions of particular officers in specific circumstances, but to the very ways in which institution of policing interacts with communities of color. Indeed, when we're trying to understand the system, we can place each of these acute instances of police violence in the context of a broader system of policing. In my research, I asked the question about what role these encounters play in fostering or undermining police community trust. And specifically, I look at police community interactions as being institutional interactions. What makes these institutional interactions? Really 2 things. On the one hand, we can think about policing as being very institutionalized. Odds are you don't interact with the same officers multiple times. You're interacting with an institution, and police departments have a great deal of organizational control over individual officers. At the same time, police officers are capable of interacting with the public in ways that departments themselves can't. So a police department can't be rude, friendly, disagreeable, or impolite, but individual officers can. So what I look at is how these 2 aspects of these interactions come together. In other words, today I'm going to be talking specifically about this interpersonal aspect of police community relations, looking at how officers communicate to Black and white drivers that they stop, how are these, and then what are the consequences of these interactions for institutional trust in the police. So this is fundamentally a psychological question, and it seems straightforward. However, when we ask questions about race and policing, and specifically about interpersonal communication in these encounters, we're faced with a challenge. So we know from past research that being respected or having an officer interact fairly is something that builds institutional trust. We know that it's important for how people see the broader legal system. However, it's a broader challenge to look at what police officers are actually doing when they're interacting with the public. So most of the sources that we have for data on police encounters are things like stop data forms or traffic stop records, institutional sources of data that can't really tell us about these interpersonal aspects of policing. So 2 traffic stops that might have the same encounter, might look very similar on paper, could actually unfold in quite different ways. So what my colleagues and I have done is looked at body camera footage as a source of data to help unpack how police officers communicate, and also as a way of seeing how different people might interpret the same interaction. Body cameras also have the advantage of being scalable. So some researchers have directly observed police community interactions by doing ride-alongs. When you think of the thousands and thousands of body camera recordings recorded each day, this gives us insight into how officers are communicating to drivers in their daily procedures, as well as what those interactions might mean to the people experiencing them. Body camera footage these cameras have really proliferated as a way to hold police accountable. You can think of high-profile body camera videos being used as evidence. Me and my colleagues have approached body camera footage as data for these interactions. And the studies I'm going to show you today are a case study done with body camera footage from one police department. So this is the Oakland Police Department in Oakland, California. Just to give a little bit of context, Oakland Police Department was one of the first agencies in the US to really widely deploy these body cameras as part of a court-mandated federal settlement. And OPD policy required officers to activate their cameras before making contact with the drivers in stops. So what we did is we looked at body camera footage from approximately 1,000 traffic stops in Oakland of black and white drivers. So these were conducted over a single month of traffic stops, and we had these recordings transcribed to basically create a script of each interaction. So this footage lets us do three things that we couldn't do before we started using body camera recordings as data. First, we can look at the content of body cameras to look at differences in how officers are communicating to black and white drivers. In other words, what are their words or even their tone of voice telling us about these interactions? Second, once you have these recordings, you can use it as an experimental treatment, as a way of exposing people to different kinds of interactions, which really lets us break into this causal relationship between how officers are communicating and how community members are making sense of that police department. And then lastly, because we all have different interactions with the police, it can be hard to say how much those differences come from us being exposed to different kinds of interactions or us interpreting similar interactions in different ways, right? So what you can do when you have a body camera recording is that you can have different people listen to that same recording and look at how people's experiences, perceptions might shape what they hear in those interactions. So today I'm going to be walking through all three of these steps, looking at how the body camera footage can tell us about this cycle of trust and mistrust. And I'm going to start off by looking at one of the most powerful tools that police officers have, and that's their words. So police officers can communicate things that are quite similar from a legal perspective in ways that either connote respect or disrespect. So in other words, an officer might ask you for your license and registration, but they can do so in a way that's polite, communicating respect. So saying something like, "Would you mind getting your license and registration for me, please, and thank you?" Or they can communicate the same message in a way that's fundamentally disrespectful. So just saying something like, "Okay, bro, give me your license and registration." So we were interested in whether we could use body camera footage to look at different ways, different words that police officers were communicating when they stopped black and white drivers in Oakland, California. So to get at this question, remember we have these big scripts of police community interactions. We had undergraduates read short snippets of these clips and then give their impressions of each one. So as you can see here, each participant in our study read a police officer's, in linguistics we call this an utterance, so basically like one line in a script, as well as the community line that directly preceded it. And for each one of these little snippets or thin slices of officer language, we were interested in the level of respect that officers communicated or didn't communicate to drivers. So we asked our participants to rate how impartial, respectful, friendly, polite, and formal the officer was towards the driver that they stopped. And so what I'm going to show you on the y-axis are these ratings for these different features on the x-axis. I'm just going to put all of the bars up here. And I want you to notice two things in this graph. First, this is a 1 to 4 scale. So most of the things that police officers say to most of the drivers that they stop are fairly respectful. However, across these interactions, we can see that there's consistent racial disparities such that officers are more formal, more friendly, more impartial, more polite, and more respectful to white drivers. And I'll also say that one of the strengths of this experimental approach is that our participants didn't know the race of the person that officers were talking to. So even though they're blinded to race, they're picking up on these differences in how officers are communicating. I'll also add that there might be some limitations in getting these ratings from undergraduate students, but we replicated these results in a community sample at an Oakland area DMV office, as well as with a completely separate set of utterances. So this can be a finding that we're quite confident of from these thin slices. But this leaves us with a problem. We had a very small number of these snippets of these thin slices of officer language rated. So how do we go from these 414 utterances to the 36,000 utterances in our entire month of body camera footage? And so to get at this question, we used computational methods to basically let us train a computer to use language like our participants did. So I'm going to walk you through each step here, but basically what I'm going to show you is this strategy involves figuring out what parts of language people use to make their judgments of respect or disrespect, figuring out what those correlations are, and then using those correlations to predict respectfulness of officer language for the remaining 36,000 utterances in our set of speech. So what we did is we trained a computer to basically identify relevant features of language. So we know from linguistics, people use different strategies when they're communicating respect. So you can think about emails that you might send your professors. You might say, I have a small request. Could you please give me a one-day extension? Thank you. So in a similar vein, we first identify different features of language in each of these thin slices of language. We then figured out how those different features correlated to participants' rating of respect. And then, so we're training this model. Once it graduated, it basically performed as well as any two people reading the same utterance. So once our model was graduated, ready to go out into the real world, we put it to work, and we had it give a single respect rating for every single utterance in the entire corpus. So put the computer to work, and what this gives us is an estimate of how respectful officers' language was for the entire set of language that we have in this month of body camera footage. So before I walk through the quantitative findings, I just want to give a qualitative sense of what we found. What are some of the differences that we observed when we looked at interactions that officers had with black versus white drivers? So one difference is that we noticed that officers communicated more concern for white drivers' safety. So they're more likely to say things like, I just want to make sure you're safe, or I just want you and your baby to be safe. These are actual excerpts from the traffic stops in our collection, by the way. We also noticed that police officers were more likely to reassure white drivers, to say things like, don't worry, you're good, it's going to be okay. What I'm going to do to give you a full sense of the results here is that I'm going to plot each feature of language on this graph with two axes. So first, on this y-axis, we're going to have how respectful or disrespectful that feature of language is. And on the x-axis, we're going to have whether it's more common when officers are talking to black drivers or more common when officers are talking to white drivers. And so just to kind of orient us to the results, some of the more respectful communication techniques that officers used involved reassuring the driver, apologizing for inconvenience, thanking the driver, and using formal titles. And what you can see here is that there's this correlation, right? Where the more disrespectful a feature of language is, the more likely it is to occur when officers are talking to black drivers. Likewise, the more respectful a feature of language, the more likely it is to occur when officers are talking to white drivers. So not only, when we have this entire month of traffic stop recordings to look at, when we have this large amount of language, it lets us test for a few other important aspects of these interactions. So because we have a respect rating for every single point in interaction, we can also look at how the trajectories of these interactions might differ across race. In other words, we can just look at the beginning, middle, and end of traffic stops to look at how these gaps in respect emerge. Because one question you might have is whether these differences in respect might be due to how drivers are communicating with the officer, and not necessarily how the officer is communicating to the driver. So I'm going to show you two lines here. Each line is going to be a different trajectory or path through these traffic stop conversations, one for white drivers and one for black drivers. I want to just highlight a few takeaways from this graph for you. First, these racial disparities in respect emerge at the very beginning of these traffic stops. So even before the driver has said a single word, we notice differences in how much respect officers are communicating to white versus black drivers. We also see that over time, these gaps widen. So even though most police interactions become more respectful over the course of the conversation, these racial disparities, these gap between these two lines grows over time. So language is a really important channel of communication. It's the most common way in which we communicate with others. But as you probably know, it's not just respect isn't just a matter of what you're saying, but also how you're saying it. So our next step was to see whether we saw, or in this case, heard racial disparities, not just in what officer said, but the tone of voice that they use when they're communicating with drivers. So we created short clips of interactions that we edited in two ways. So we removed the driver's language so that participants could only hear the police officer's communication. And then we also applied a filter so that participants couldn't hear what the officer was saying. They could only hear their tone of voice. So I'm going to play two clips for you, just to give you a sense of what our participants in these studies listen to. Okay, that's one clip, and here's a second one.
Okay. Is that two in here? Is that your name in here? What's your name? Did you have another type of specification besides this? And either right going to do or anything like that?
Okay. So two things you might have noticed from these clips. First, they kind of sound like the grown-ups in Charlie Brown. It's hard to tell what the officers are saying. It kind of sounds like womp, 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 womp. The second is that even though you don't have a lot of information, you have very little information, in fact, from these interactions, you can still get a sense about how those two traffic stops feel different, right? That first traffic stop was a police officer in Oakland stopping a white man. The second one was an officer interacting with a black driver. So we were interested in whether these racial disparities also emerged when people were just attending to the tone, when they couldn't tell what was going on in the interaction, but they could still get this gist of how officers were communicating. So similar design as before, we had participants listen to different clips of interactions, this time attending just to the officer's tone of voice. And we asked them how at ease or tense was the officer, whether they were respectful or disrespectful, or friendly or cold towards the driver. So just as we did with language, we did three versions of this study. We did one in a psychology lab on our campus. Went back to the DMV office. One advantage of running studies at the DMV is that you have a lot of people that would rather be doing anything besides waiting in line to have their number called. So we had community participants at the Oakland DMV participate in our studies. And then we also wanted to ensure that any findings we found were consistent across different stimuli, across different clips. So we made sure to sample and also resample these clips to ensure that our findings are generalizable. And what we find across these samples is that even though participants had very little information to go on, and even though they didn't know the race of the person the officer was talking to, they still picked up on these differences in how officers were communicating. That officers communicated more respect, more friendliness, and more ease with white drivers relative to African American drivers. So this is a small difference, but I want you to consider that in most of our interactions, we're not just being exposed to a police officer, garbling their language for like 10 seconds, right? You have to think about not only the full scope of police interactions and traffic stops, but also the fact that people have multiple interactions with the same institution, right? So just to summarize so far, we see consistent differences in the respect that police officers communicate towards black and white drivers. Next, I want to talk about the implications of these differences. In other words, how might your perspective of law enforcement or a department change if you're exposed to the types of interactions that African American drivers in Oakland have with police officers, or if you're exposed to the types of interactions that white drivers have with police? So we can answer this question because now we know how officers are communicating, and we can expose people to different interactions. So in other words, we can experimentally test what exposing people to these different police community interactions means for how they view the police. So I spent a lot of summers at the DMV, I have to admit. We went back to the DMV, and this time we had community members, again, listen to police officers' tone of voice. So the same clips that I just talked about, we had participants listen to them again. However, this time what we did is we told participants that they'd be listening to a lot of clips, and we asked them to form an impression of the police department. What we didn't tell participants is that they're randomly assigned to one of two conditions. Half of our participants listened exclusively to clips of officers communicating with black drivers. The other half of our participants listened to police officers communicating with white drivers. And so in addition to asking for people's impressions of the officers' communication, we also asked them questions about how they would view the police department from which these clips were sampled. In other words, how much do you think this police department cares about the community? How much would you trust officers in this police department? And do you think officers in this department would treat you fairly? In other words, how does these interpersonal aspects of police officers' communication relate to community members' institutional trust? So I'm going to show you two findings. The first is just conceptually, did we replicate what we found when we asked participants about individual clips? In other words, after listening to a fair number of these interactions, how did participants think that officers were communicating? And so consistent with our past results, we found racial disparities, and that participants thought that officers communicating to white drivers were communicated more positively, more respectful, more at ease, and more friendly. I want to note that the size of this effect is larger than what we observed in our previous studies. In other words, this gives some evidence for that accumulation I was talking about, where when you listen to repeated interactions, you form a stronger judgment of officers' communication. More importantly, we saw that participants had different impressions of this police department based on the clips that they heard. In other words, when participants were exposed to officers talking to white drivers, they had a higher level of institutional trust in that agency than if they had listened to officers communicating with black drivers. And I'll add to this that we found that participants, this held true for white participants, participants of color, across demographic groups. So this is some of the first experimental evidence we have about how aspects of officer communication, even these relatively subtle aspects like tone of voice or snippets of language, can undermine institutional trust in the police. So we can also return to this question about how different people might interpret the same interaction differently. In other words, knowing that these interactions can lead to gaps in trust in the police, how does this then shape how people experience subsequent interactions? In other words, would someone who has a great deal of trust in the police interpret the same interaction a little bit differently than individuals who had different types of experiences? And so because of the way we designed our study, we can look at our results not just based off of our experimental condition, but also looking at differences among participants. So basically what I'm going to show you now, this is the same finding I just showed you here. And what we're looking at the y-axis is just how influential were these different factors in participants' judgments. So we know from this previous graph I just showed that the race of the person the officer is talking to makes a difference. We can also look at things like participants' trust. And one question we were really interested in here was about participants' experiences with the police. So you might predict that if you've just experienced more positive outcomes, so if you've been given a warning versus a ticket, that might shape your judgments, right? But we wanted to go a little bit further. We believe that it isn't just the positivity of the outcomes, but also just how police officers are treating you, how fairly or unfairly you experience those interactions with law enforcement. And so we asked our participants in this study to think back to the most recent time that they were stopped by the police and just report how positive the outcome was for them personally and whether they felt that they were treated fairly or not. Okay. What we find is participants' trust in the police is just as influential as the race of the driver in informing these judgments. In other words, people who trust the police more tend to view those ambiguous clips of the Charlie Brown tone of voice more positively than our participants that were more skeptical or vigilant towards law enforcement. As for this question about people's experiences and how they inform how they interpret these interactions, people who reported more receiving more procedurally fair treatment at the hands of police viewed these interactions more positively. But it wasn't a matter of whether you'd gotten a ticket or a warning. There wasn't a relationship between how positive or negative the outcome of this stop was in participants' interpretation of officer communication. Okay. So I want to just pause here and see if there are any questions so far as we kind of go through this cycle. In other words, what these studies represent is how racial disparities in officer respect can erode institutional trust and influence how people perceive subsequent encounters. Do people have questions about any of the data or methods that talked about so far? Yes. Yeah, so the question is, how much do different officers' demographics or diversity influence these disparities that we found? We didn't find any evidence for officers' background influencing these judgments. One reason for that could be just the limited number of officers we had in our sample, but it wasn't the case that white officers were more or less disrespectful than African American or Latina police officers. When it came to tone of voice, we did notice a difference in how participants judged male and female officers, where female officers were judged as being more at ease, more friendly, more respectful. But one of the limitations of this design is we're kind of limited by both the officers and the drivers making stops in this month of footage. Other questions? Yes. Yeah, so the question here is, when did we ask participants about their prior experiences? We asked it at the end of the study. So I'll say two things that might seem somewhat contradictory. We didn't find, and so like this is important because it could be that like the clips that we expose participants to kind of shape their judgments, right? So in this study, we didn't observe any differences in participant trust or, their self-report of previous experiences based on the experimental condition. Having said that, in other studies, we've exposed participants to either just the most positive or the most negative interactions overall. And one thing that was kind of surprising is that even just those short exposures in like a laboratory setting actually moved around participants' trust. So this is to say that in this study, we treat it as a relatively like stable like demographic like feature of participants. But it's also the case that when people are making these judgments, they're often informed by the types of clips that we expose them to. So that's an excellent question. Yes. Yeah. So thanks for bringing that up. This is it's basically an effect size, which is just a way of comparing differences or how influential different variables are. So this blue dot right here, so it's like around 0.3. That just corresponds to like the standardized difference between these two variables. And so this just gives us a way of comparing variables that are on different like different units of measurement to each other and kind of trying to weight how big they are. So this sample size of 0.3 is like a small to moderate effect size. We observe it both for the clips that participants were exposed to, as well as their trust. Okay, so in the second part of my talk, I want to shift gears a little bit. So far, I've talked about this cycle through which interpersonal aspects of police officers' communication, whether they're communicating respect or disrespect, how that can contribute to racial disparities in police community trust. And so, having done a lot of research on the factors that undermine trust, I want to shift from thinking about body camera footage as a tool for revealing inequities to it being a tool for measuring change. And so my collaborators and I, after we did our research on police language, tried to incorporate it into a training for Oakland Police Department officers. And specifically, this was part of a training on these broader principles of procedural justice, this idea that police officers should communicate respect, trustworthiness, neutrality, and give community members a voice in their interactions. So as part of this training, we incorporated our findings on language. We had officers identify in which ways that they communicated successfully or in ways that they observed other officers communicating in ways that eroded trust. We had officers give younger police officers tips on how to foster these respectful interactions. And we also communicated the message that when police officers communicate respect, it helps helps build a pool of trust that benefits other officers. So I'm happy to talk more about the training, the challenges, and some of the lessons that we learned during this interaction. But one of the things that we learned just from using body camera footage is that we could also use this footage as a tool to measure whether officers actually engage in the communication techniques that the training covered. So in other words, we looked at body camera recordings from police officers, and then checked each one to see whether they actually did these 5 things. So because there was a staggered rollout of this training, we could look at body camera recordings relative to when each individual officer was trained. And what we did is we compared how many of these techniques officers actually used when they communicate with the public. One additional thing I want to say here is that this is not an anti-bias training, in that we're not trying to change police officers' individual attitudes. There's a lot of research coming out now talking about the limits of anti-bias training and how police officers who go through such training, they report being more concerned about bias, but there isn't any actual change in behavior. In this training, we specifically try to influence specific behaviors in interactions. So some of the core findings so far is that we've found that officers employed a greater number of these techniques post-training. So there was a question in the back about kind of like that y-axis on the previous graph. So this is the effect size for the training. I want to highlight that 0.17 is a pretty small effect. So it's modest on average, going from about 3 to 3.5 of these communication techniques in each stop. That said, officers were over twice as likely to use all 5 of the recommended techniques in their stop. So in other words, officers are twice as likely to explicitly state the reason for the stop, introduce themselves, and enact all 5 of those aspects of communication. And we find that these differences hold when we control for things like the driver's age, race of the driver, race of the officer, whether the stop ended in an arrest or a warning. So it seems to be small but consistent effects of the training. And because we're getting these, we can use body camera recordings to look at these specific aspects of these interactions. We can break it down and just see what were officers doing before the training and what were they doing after they were trained. I'm going to put all of these up here. And so we can see places in which this training made a difference, as well as places where it didn't seem to have any discernible effect. So one of the things that we found is, officers, 85% of the time began by greeting the driver and introducing themselves with their name. So because it was kind of at ceiling before, we didn't observe any difference in post-training stops. What we did observe, what really seems to be going on here is that officers were more likely to explicitly state the reason they're stopping the driver versus saying things like, why I'm pulling you over, or asking for license and registration, like not giving a reason at all. Officers were more likely to express concern for the driver's safety, and they're more likely to reassure drivers in these interactions. So I'd like to close my talk with a theoretical point, a methodological point, and then a practical point. And the first point is that it's really challenging to work at different levels of analysis. So when we're thinking about racial inequality in the criminal justice system, it isn't just a problem that exists in individuals, right? It is a systemic and institutional problem. And so when we're trying to intervene, characterize, and understand bias, we often lose something by focusing on one level at the expense of the others. So hopefully by breaking into these traffic stop interactions, they highlight how they can serve as a point of contact between individuals and institutions. And that it's not just about individual officers being friendly or disrespectful, right? It's about what those officers are communicating about the institution they represent. Likewise, if you get stopped and the officer drives away, that's not the end of your interaction with that broader institution of policing. And so one of the things that hope to convey in this research is how interactions can let us look at both systems and individuals at the same time. So at a methodological level, body camera footage gives us a way of unpacking, not just as a source of evidence, but as a source of data, racial inequities in everyday police encounters. They also let us ask basic questions of how these interpersonal aspects of police interactions can translate into how people understand institutions. And this is incredibly important if we want to change policing. And that many of the things that want to change about policing and change about police community interactions are hard to measure. And if you don't have a way of measuring change, you don't have a way of knowing whether changes you're making to policing are having any effect in how officers are actually behaving. So, a third hope of this work is that body camera footage can be a tool to both spur and motivate change in police interactions, but also a way of capturing that change as we push for reimagining and reforming the system of policing. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this work, both my individual collaborators as well as my institutional partners. And thank you for your attention, and open it up for questions. Yes. So one of the limitations just of this general design is that we usually try to sample at like the stop level. And so it's hard for us to make strong conclusions about officers. I will just say, like, having sat in on some of the training sessions, often it was the younger officers that were a little more focused on enforcement maybe at the expense of these more relational parts of policing. So I think that broader question of police culture, how officers are recruited and acculturated is a really fascinating one. One that unfortunately I think our data don't do a great job of speaking to. Yes. Yeah, so the stars on the graph just represent statistical significance. So in other words, it's just kind of how, in thinking about kind of the variation on each of those bars, can we be confident in the difference between those bars given that variation? And so where you saw the stars, that meant just kind of at a common threshold that we use, we can say that that difference kind of outweighs the variation between those groups. Yes. Yep. So that's a great question. Specifically, two things. Why did we look at the things we did, and what are some things that got left out? So we decided to limit ourselves to those 5 communication techniques because those are specific behaviors that we told officers to do. And when we were trying to distill some of the findings from the research into these recommendations, one of the things we thought about was how easy is it to change some of these things. So things like tone of voice, other things like disfluencies like and were negatively related to respect. We thought that officers might have a harder time regulating those. So we decided to focus on concrete actions that we think they could consciously change. So I think it's worth going back to those recordings and seeing whether there were differences in these other aspects of communication. Because one thing you might be concerned with is, are officers changing these behaviors like kind of on paper, but not actually changing how they interact with their public? So that's a really important question. Saw a hand over here. Yes. Yeah. So the question is thinking about different officers, and that's a really important observation because what we find is there are a few officers that make a lot of stops. And so if we just sampled at random, we'd only be sampling from a small number of officers. We set an upper limit of 15 stops per officer. The modal number of stops, the most common number of stops in our data set was 1. But you have some officers that just make a ton of stops. And that's important because we can't tell as researchers whether that says something about that officer's assignment, whether there are officers that were assigned to just kind of watch like an intersection and like catch people like running stop signs, or whether those are officers that are more aggressive about enforcement. So we kind of traded off this balance by truncating or limiting the number of stops that we could have from a single officer. Yes.
Looking into this information, did you find it at least informational to look at like how and why these behaviors from these officers are coming about? Like if it's taught from, an officer, and then his colleague or so on and so forth, or is this a more personal, are these coming from like more personal situations, or, did you guys take that into account at all?
So that's something that we couldn't really capture in this study, but I will say from the research that we know on racial bias in policing, both of those intuitions are correct. So the first one was about kind of like social networks of police officers. And one finding that we know from sociology and criminal justice is that police misconduct tends to spread in networks, and that if you have like a sergeant or someone responsible for training that is aggressive or facilitating thank you. Facilitating negative behavior, that spreads to the people they train. The second question about officers' individual attitudes, we also know that makes a difference. So there was a study a couple of years ago looking at social dominance orientation, which is a way of saying how much, as an individual, do you support kind of social hierarchies, or the idea that different individuals or different groups like have a place. And that actually relates to the number of complaints that police officers have and how they use force against individuals. Likewise, other studies, there was a question earlier about the demographic composition of police officers. We didn't observe differences, but there have been other studies looking at, over a large period of time in like the Chicago Police Department, officers of color are less likely to receive complaints and also less likely to use force. So there's clearly things going on at the officer level that we could not do a great job of capturing this study, but definitely speak to those intuitions and those hypotheses. Yes, in back.
So do you know if the higher respect had any effect on like the immediate outcome of the stop or anything?
That is a great question. So the question is about, could you predict the outcome of the stop from the respect? Is that fair to say? So this is a useful question because the answer to it, I think, kind of reveals some of the limitations of us focusing on language. Interactions that had more respectful language were more likely to end in a warning. That said, it's hard to tell how much of that is, the respectful language leading to a warning, or just something about those different types of stops making respectful language more likely to occur in those stops that end in a warning. I do think that some other work that we have that kind of speaks to this is we looked at how the earliest moments of these interactions might relate to the ultimate outcome. Thinking about issues of escalation, we specifically looked at outcomes of the driver being handcuffed or arrested. And what we find is if you look at the language in the first 27 seconds, you can predict above chance whether it's going to be a stop that ends in a warning or a ticket, or a stop that ends in a handcuffing or arrest. And for me as a psychologist, the second part of the study that I think is just as important is we had African-American men listen to these clips, listen just to the first 27 seconds, and they could just pick up on the difference in the energy and the communication that officers were engaging with in those two different types of stops. So, I think it kind of speaks to how in some cases, many cases, these interactions can be different, like from the start, and then go from there. Yes.
And listen to that as well, and could they pick up on the same things?
That's a great question. So in this study about escalation, we did not. I think there's this broader question about, I talked a little bit about how different individuals might hear or interpret interactions differently based on kind of their trust in the police. I do have one slide I can show you about different interpretations across race. To do that, I'm going to have to unhide a slide. So this might take the remainder of the time allotted, but let's see if we can do it. Oh, here it is. Great, that's showing up. So I realize I just put this graph up, but don't look at the graph. Another limitation of the studies I've talked about is that they focus a lot on what goes on in the interaction and not a lot about what goes on before that interaction even takes place. Like, why is the driver stopped, for example? And this is really important because if you look at the reasons why black and white drivers are stopped in the US, black drivers are much more likely to be stopped for high discretion offenses like a broken taillight, tinted window, or expired registration. And so we were interested in what those different reasons for the stop might communicate to black and white listeners. And basically, so we had people listen to traffic stop recordings, went to the DMV again, traffic stop recordings of stops that were made for equipment violations like a broken taillight, expired registration sticker, or stops that were made for something like speeding, running a stop sign, things that pose more of a risk for public safety. And so the officer probably has less choice in enforcing that law. And let's just focus on how fair the decision was. What we find is that our white participants actually don't discern a difference between these stops. So they'll hear something like an officer saying like, "Hey, your window was tinted, so I pulled you over," and that just sounds just as legitimate as, "Hey, you ran a red light, so I have to pull you over." But for our participants of color, that context means a lot, right? It makes the difference between saying, the officer had a great deal of choice, and so they decided to pull you over, or you were actually doing something for which there was a legitimate reason to be stopped. And so what we find is that African American participants do make this distinction between high and low discretion stops. So in my mind, I think this is one, even though we didn't see this with tone of voice or language, this is a very concrete way in which these interactions mean different things across race, right? In part because how officers interact, how they make those decisions differ across race as well. So thank you for bringing up that point. In the back, then this.
Did you and your collaborators conduct the same study for other minority groups such as Asian or Latino populations? And if so, where did that place in between black and white stops?
Another great question, because I think it also reveals another limitation of language. Specifically, this was all English, officer speaking English, driver speaking English. That's something that we're working on now, thinking about respect as I might, when officers are speaking Spanish and drivers are speaking Spanish. In the work that we did with the training, we found black-white disparities. Other groups are kind of intermediate. So the clearest distinctions here are between the interactions that officers are having with black drivers and with white drivers. And that is both a function of how officers are addressing black drivers and also just the large amount of like deference and respect that they're communicating to white drivers. Yes.
Thank you. I think this is really important to be able to like quantify these really complex interactions. So thank you for coming and sharing this with us. I'm interested more in the training that you had, that you gave, and talking about the changes in sort of the overall respect. And did you notice that? Did you separate out the interactions with black and white drivers after the training, and like, are they just being much more respectful to white drivers, but they really aren't changing to black drivers, or like, have you actually looked and separated that out?
Yeah. So another really important question that I think is crucial when we're thinking about interventions. So your question is basically, did this training make already respectful interactions with white drivers more respectful? Where officers are like, oh yeah, I should remember to do that fifth thing that I don't do when I'm talking to white drivers. So we're limited in that, you might have noticed the large disparity in just the number of white and black stops in our sample. The same is true when we're looking at the training. That said, I have the exact same concerns. The change mostly seems to be in stops of black drivers. It isn't the case that this intervention is shifting how officers are talking to white drivers. It really seems the bulk of it is officers doing things that they should be doing, but we're not doing in conversations with black drivers. Yes.
But towards the end of your slides, you were kind of speaking positively towards like body cam footage and things. So how do you, I guess, combat, or at least in your research, how do you combat, having this positive body cam footage, as opposed to create more opportunities to, be able to pick apart these interactions and things of that nature? But also, how do you combat the opposite, and officers are still initiating this negative behavior and these negative interactions, even with the body cams, still being present? Does that like show and tell, like, the real
Persistence.
or you say motive behind some of the, the police officers, and their real bias, even with still having the body cam, some of them are still showing, these adverse behaviors.
So the hope when body cameras were introduced 10 years ago is that they would change police officers' behavior. Evidence for that is mixed. A lot of it depends on whether that footage is actually reviewed or not. The second hope was that body camera footage will be a source of evidence to capture evidence of police misconduct. Some cases, yes. Other cases, the footage can be ambiguous in that can be hard to get, like kind of like a smoking gun type of evidence. We can all think of cases where that footage is really important for bringing instances of brutality to light, right? So I think, in my view, what's just as important is like for all of the incidents that don't end in violence or don't make the news, you can still kind of see what some of these trends and undercurrents are, and you can try to intervene to change the bottom of that pyramid that I showed at the beginning. The other thing I want to say is, thinking about racial inequality in policing, there's so many processes that feed into it and so much that supports it. I'm not trying to say that the only thing that needs to change in policing is just like please and thank you, right? That'd be ridiculous. But I am saying that one of the features of these interactions that undermines trust is officers just not extending basic respect. And that's something that we can try to change while also thinking of reforms at different levels. Because just as one process is responsible for maintaining racial inequality in policing, there's no like one fix that's going to mitigate it. Yes.
The big difference of observational studies is people act differently when they know they're being observed. So for these body cam footage, you said one of the hopes was that it would have officers be held more accountable. So you think these differences are obviously going to be much more stark when they don't have a body camera on, or do you think they kind of like forget it's there?
So there have been a few different studies looking at this. Some of them find complaints go down. Some find use of force go down. Some find it goes down at first, and then officers become accustomed, like you said. I will say one of the advantages is that if you're doing like an observation, like a ride along with a police officer, they know that you're observing them. And some studies have found that officers are more like 5 times as likely to stop someone if there's like a ride along observer in the car, which is, we can think of several reasons that's a problem. One of the things that body cameras let us do here is we kind of went back in time before these officers were trained, before they knew that we were observing them for this purpose, to look at how they're interacting. So I think it does kind of reduce some, if not all, of those concerns about but officers changing their behavior because they know that they're being monitored. I saw it in the back here.
Paying attention when you were doing your studies and stuff like this, did you ever pay attention to how the driver interacts with the officer, or was it just the interaction between the officer and the driver, like how the communication was? Because in a lot of situations, the driver can then heat up the situation and make it worse and make it worse and make it worse, to where the officer then has to step in and become more, I wouldn't say aggressive, but become more stern and maybe have to raise their voice a bit more. Did you ever pay attention to that, or was it kind of just how you blurred out the driver's voice and you just heard the officers?
Right. So a really important point here is that for a talk about interactions, it's, we're removing one entire half of this conversation. I think that's really important. Let me just say, for the specific claims I'm making this talk, like, we do see these disparities very early, which suggests to me that it's not only racial disparities aren't just coming from drivers, how drivers are interacting with police officers. That said, one of the things that becomes really tricky when we think about the community member side is, first, so much of the interaction is dictated by the officer. So, most of the things that community members say are either responses to officers' questions, clarification questions. And so it's pretty rare to have something where the community member's driving the conversation the same way rather than just responding. The other thing is, I think there's a lot more variability in what constitutes respectful speech towards an officer than what constitutes respectful speech from an officer towards a driver. And let me just give you one example. And this is a question I'm super interested in. You can think of asking a question about the legitimacy of the stop, like, why are you pulling me over? Or saying, like, I wasn't going over the speed limit. Like, those types of questions, you can interpret them as either being disrespectful to the officer, or you can interpret them as being assertive of your rights as a citizen, right? And I think there's a lot more room for interpretation there. I think it deserves being teased out, but it just meant in this study that we couldn't use the same exact approach that we're using for thinking about officer respect to think about driver respect. In the back, and then in the middle.
Isn't it something, though, that with those interactions that it doesn't matter how the citizen acts or reacts, that it's the officer's job to be respectful no matter what? Like, they're not supposed to lose it if you have amendment rights, and even if somebody's being disrespectful, isn't it on the officer to be above that, to be above reproach?
So another reason here to focus on the officer is that officers being paid by the state, and thinking about how to intervene, a stronger lever would be changing how officers are communicating with the public. So I agree with that characterization.
In other studies, for ride-along studies, officers were 5 times more likely to pull somebody over. So in those interactions, were they more likely to be using respectful language and treating people respectfully because there was that person riding along, or were they more likely to be demonstrating more aggressive behavior and disrespectful language as a power play to show that ride-along person what it means to be a police officer and assert dominance in that manner?
So my interpretation of, it's not my study, but my interpretation of that finding is that officers wanted to show that they were doing something, that they were like being productive to the person in the ride along. And so that could be one way of showing, one way that the officer believes that they can show that. There have also been some really great systematic social observation studies looking at procedural justice training, which log the same kinds of things that we're getting automatically from the footage. So I don't want to say it's like it's an approach or a method that doesn't yield any results, but you do have to contend to a greater degree with these questions about how much you're observing behavior and how much you're shaping it.
Comment to what the student or the individual asked. As a former probation officer, and one of my duties or responsibilities was to ride with officers. So I had a community police officer, and I must say that I rode with different officers, and their behavior was more aggressive than because I was riding with them and I was observing them. They appeared to all of the officers that I encountered and did the ride-alongs with, they were showing more aggressive behavior, also making derogatory statements about citizens in the community. I went on high-speed chases just because they noticed a person driving without their license. And so they knew that they had a suspended license and they weren't supposed to be driving. So we actually went on a high-speed chase in the city of Grand Rapids on a busy street. So those types of behaviors to me would, by that question that was asked or the statement that was asked, solidifies that officers, if they're being observed, they're going to be more show some more aggressive type of behavior. And that was just one incident, but I can share more incidents to kind of prove that statement or question.
Two things. First is kind of speaking to this point about officers like acting differently, like with an observer in the car. If we could think about ways that could vary. In this case, engaging in like riskier behavior. And the second thing is also I want to highlight like the reason for that chase is being one where it's like highly discretionary, right? Like expired registration is something that officers have a lot of choice about whether and when to enforce. Yes, in Spartan's hat.
So during this study, I know you mentioned you did Oakland County. Was there differences in if you managed to see it all other counties, the way officers acted, or even in other states?
So this is Oakland, California, but I will say it's another limitation of this work is that it is extremely difficult to get body camera footage, let alone match it to stops. And I think it does raise this question about, are we observing dynamics within one city that are representative of a whole? And if so, and if not, like, what are the features that vary across police departments? That's a place I'd love to look at in this research, seeing whether these disparities are not just consistent, but consistent in size, or whether there's different aspects of organizations that might either reduce or exacerbate them. So I think that's a really important observation. The front, and then yes.
More on the importance of tone in addition to recommended language and how that plays whether it plays a significant role or just some small role in general, or like things such as cadence or speed of speech. Was that anything that was factored into the study?
Yeah, so I hear two things. First, I'll answer the second part first, which is these different aspects of tone. One of the things that made tone pretty challenging to get at in this study is that this is not like a controlled setting. It's like body camera recordings of traffic stops. So things like kind of cadence and a lot of these kind of acoustic features of speech, they varied quite drastically. Sometimes because of what officers were saying, sometimes because there was like wind. So that's why we have this pretty coarse measure of just kind of like what did people think of the tone. I'll also say that tone is it's a subtle signal, but it's an important one. People can tell like status from tone. It matters in these hierarchical relationships. That said, I don't think an effective intervention would be like telling officers to kind of like speak in a different register or try to like swing their tone of voice. I think it's a better signal of how officers are approaching these interactions than it is kind of like something that you try to like go in and change in the same way that you change language.
The training, I'm curious as to how soon you took the data after the training was done and what effect you think that had on the data that you got.
Yep, great question. So the question is, for these post-training stops, how far removed were they from the training? So we looked at a window of 4 weeks prior to 4 weeks following stop. So the maximum, difference or distance from the training would be like 28 days. I can say that over that 28-day period, it did make a difference if an officer was trained like 3 days or 28 days. So we didn't see that decay within that window. However, problem with a lot of trainings is that like those are perishable skills. And so I'd be curious if we went back to look at those officers' interactions, whether we still observe those differences or whether those are skills that if you're not refreshing or practicing, you eventually revert back to baseline. It's in the back.
Are you aware if like the department made any changes in regards to your findings?
So I would say this training is like this came directly from our results where we presented them to community groups in Oakland, and they wanted this incorporated into training for the police department. Some of the other things we've also, I don't know how much of this change is due to us or other factors the department was responding to. Those things about, like the thing about stops for equipment stickers or tinted windows, those discretionary stops they're pretty responsive to how, like what the department's policy is. And so in Ann Arbor and Philadelphia, like some agencies are saying like, you shouldn't make those equipment stops anymore. So I don't want to say that Berkeley Police Department's one department that also made this change. I don't want to say we're responsible to it, but I do think that one of the things that we hope to do with these results is to help inform policies, especially since the racial disparities in equipment stops is orders of magnitude higher than it is for like speeding and running red lights. At least it was in Oakland. Yes.
Feedback from the officers themselves about how they felt their efforts to be more respectful and incorporate those 5 aspects of respectful language affected their workday, if it had a positive change for them and made them feel like better about their work.
Yeah, so great question about like kind of the officer feedback side of things. Our feedback was limited to just kind of like like a post-training like feedback form. So, to be blunt, it's not super informative because it's usually just kind of generic, like thank you type of stuff. I will say that there's another project looking at how police officers start interactions, specifically whether they start with a justification for that interaction or just kind of like start making small talk. If a police officer comes up to you and starts making small talk, first thing you're going to ask is like, why is this officer talking to me, right? And so what they find is this intervention where the officer explains like why they're initiating contact. Not only does that change the interactions, but it also like the officers can pick up on that difference. So I'd be curious as to whether officers are noticing differences from this this intervention, or whether or not.
So you mentioned that African American drivers were far more likely to be pulled over for equipment issues. Now, is it possible that is because they are more likely to have issues with their cars because of a lower average SES? Or have you not kind of
Yeah, so this
considered
is
that?
this is a common question that comes up thinking about racial profiling, and it's called like the denominator problem because you don't know the base rates of any of the offenses for which officers are stopping drivers. Some of the evidence that gets around this looks at stops around like daylight savings time. If you look at same period of time, we all know unfortunately we're going to be losing an hour of sunlight soon. Officers are more likely to stop black drivers immediately prior to than following daylight savings time. So that's some evidence that we have that that accounts for any differences there may be in base rates of offending for traffic violations. I think the point I try to make with the discretionary stops is that like people lose track of what it means in the context of that interaction. And when you're getting pulled over, the question that you're asking as the driver isn't about how many other people have expired registration. It's about why is this officer stopping you? And so I think that ambiguity when it's a stop for a high discretion offense, like expired tags, I think that's something that gets lost if we just kind of make it a narrow question about racial profiling. And I think it's something that really matters for what community members take away from this, take away from these interactions. So I don't make any claims about what proportion of white drivers are driving with expired tags, besides saying that I did it for about 4 months. But I will say that when you look at among people who were stopped, there's those differences in the context, and that's meaningful even outside of the discussion about base rates. Yes.
Do you think studies like this are being performed in other countries, or like racial disparities like this are common? Is common in the U.S.?
So great question about are racial disparities in the U.S. More extreme or less extreme than other countries? I know just a little about this, but I do know there was a report out of the UK asking this question, and basically you find disparities between minoritized groups around the world. They are particularly acute in the US. Also in Australia, if you look at white and Aboriginal populations, it's actually more extreme disparities in incarceration rates. So this is a way of saying that these systems of inequality are quite pervasive, but they're also quite extreme in the US. But I think that's an excellent question.
There was significantly more black drivers that were stopped to white drivers. Is that partially because of the general population of Oakland is much higher, or is it more profiling that was happening, if you know?
Right. I can't say with this data. I will say that it's just like if you benchmark it against population, it's disproportionate. But as I said in the earlier question, like the question that always comes up here is it disproportionate compared to rates of offending? And that it's an unknown. So I can't make definitive claims beyond what we know in the social sciences about some of these tightly controlled studies that speak broadly to racial profiling. Yes.
Amounts of respect shown similarly to like lower economic status whites as well?
So it's tricky to say because first you have to operationalize SES, which I suppose you could do from the model of the car. The second is that SES and race in Oakland are pretty strongly confounded. So you could think about like experimental studies if you wanted to disentangle this. I would just say that if you pick average black driver who stopped average white driver, you'd see these differences. Yes.
Recordings and the body cameras, like did they have like a specific location, such as maybe like some of them might have been in like higher socioeconomic neighborhoods than lower ones?
Right. So the question is, what's like, the spatial distribution of these stops. when we looked at language, we controlled for local crime rate, as well as the, like what district the stops were conducted in. It doesn't appear to make a difference, but I think it does speak to this broader point of these interactions aren't just kind of like occurring in thin air. Likewise, when officers are like patrolling different neighborhoods, they don't patrol all spaces equally, right? So I think it's important when we're thinking about what are the dynamics within these stops to realize that, that question can't be completely separated from how are officers conducting stops in the first place. And that includes both who they're stopping and also where and why they're stopping them. Thank you, everyone.